Okay, that's the Sunday papers, and now we'll go straight to our program guest, and it's WA Liberal Senator, Senator Dean Smith, who joins us from Canberra. Good morning. Thanks for coming along.
Good morning, Barry.
So, can you confirm that no matter what happens in the party room tomorrow, it's your plan to introduce this bill into the Senate this week?
Well, the first thing I'd say, Barry, is that tomorrow when I go into the party room, I'll be arguing as vigorously I can to my colleagues to uphold those great traditions that were set in place first by Menzies, then executed under Howard on no less than 5 separate occasions, and that was to allow issues like this to be resolved by free vote or by conscience vote in the Parliament. That's the first argument I'll be making. We have now drafted and released a private senators bill, depending on where it gets introduced. That bill, the Marriage Amendment Definition and Religious Freedoms Bill, is the best bill, the most comprehensive bill the Parliament has ever had in regards to not only providing for same-sex marriage, but importantly respecting those community attitudes that would like to see religious freedoms protected as well.
When you say where it might be introduced, you haven't yet decided whether it'll go to the Senate first or the House first?
Well, I think it's important that for the moral authority of the bill that it be introduced into the House first. But Barry, this is a very, very good bill, an excellent bill. What's important here is that as a result of the Senate committee inquiry that was undertaken at the beginning of this year, the result of that inquiry was a consensus report that didn't talk about the case for and against marriage. Instead, it said if the Australian Parliament was to legislate for marriage, what are the considerations that it would have to sort of put in place in order to have a bill that would meet community standards, community expectations. So that's the first element of this bill, which I think is unique. The second element of this bill is that none of the other bills that have ever come before the Parliament, and we've had in excess of 15 of them, none of the other bills have more comprehensively dealt with the issue of religious freedoms or religious protections. And might I just add this point? This is a coalition-led bill. People cannot be guaranteed that if a future Labor government is elected, these religious freedoms will be there.
Now, if it was to go into the House first, who would introduce it?
Well, I would like to see the government sanction a free vote, a parliamentary free vote, and then of course any member of the House of Representatives would be free to introduce that bill, to debate that bill, to bring it to the Senate, and then hopefully have a parliamentary resolution of the issue of same-sex marriage once and for all.
Now, if you look at the numbers, and we'll take the Senate first, even if you had Labor, and that's not guaranteed, you wouldn't get all of Labor, there are some who would have a problem with it, the Greens, Darren Hinch, Nick Xenophon, you would still need, how many of your colleagues do you think to support it?
Well, I understand, Barry, that some people like to sort of, pore over the minutiae minute by minute. These are the numbers today,
well,
these were the numbers yesterday.
In terms of whether the bill will be successful.
It matters, but when it matters is more important. So now people have before them a good bill, an excellent bill that will not only provide for same-sex marriage, but importantly provide for religious freedom protections. Now, this is important because there might be some people in my own party, some people in the Parliament indeed, that would like to legislate for same-sex marriage but want to be satisfied that those religious freedoms will be in place. This bill does that. So I argue that when we go into the parliamentary meeting tomorrow afternoon, I'll be arguing for a free vote, but more than that, people will have an idea about what sort of legislative option is before them, and they'll be able to make an assessment about whether or not this is a bill that they would like to support under a parliamentary free vote. Yep. I might just add, Barry, of course, anyone can bring their own bill to the Parliament.
Yeah. You must have thought, though, about how many of your own colleagues will be needed for this to be successful?
Well, what I've thought about is what are those things that my colleagues are looking most closely towards in terms of giving them confidence, giving them reassurance that same-sex marriage can be legislated in our country while at the same time protecting religious freedoms. Okay. This is a bill that Labor will not introduce. This is a bill that has been born, if you like, out of a consensus Senate report. I think there's a real opportunity now for us to embrace a parliamentary free vote in the same way that Howard did on 5 separate occasions, which is very much the Menzian tradition of our party.
But what happens if the party party room meeting tomorrow specifically has a secret ballot and supports a plebiscite and specifically rules out a conscience vote, what then?
Well, I think, Barry, this debate has been sort of characterised by lots of colour and movement, lots of hypotheticals. It is most definitely one step at a time. There are a number of options before the party room. I'll be arguing the parliamentary free vote option because I think that is most consistent with our traditions, but more importantly, there's an electoral advantage to that. And that is the matter gets dealt with quickly by the Parliament and is settled once and for all. Then, of course, there is the original plebiscite idea, and I understand that my colleagues, some of my colleagues, will want to maintain their commitment to that election promise. Then, of course, there's the postal plebiscite option.
Yeah, just before we get on to the postal plebiscite, but going back onto the plebiscite, and you talk about it being a promise, when that failed in the Parliament, did that promise then lapse in your mind?
Well, I think, Barry, and to be clear, I've never supported the plebiscite at a philosophical level, but let's be clear, the plebiscite idea has been around for 2 years. It has failed to win public support. Parliament doesn't support it, but more importantly than that, the country doesn't support it. When people discovered it came at $170 million, that there was to be a public funding campaign of yes and no, that some of my colleagues decided that they would not be bound by its outcome, public support crashed for the plebiscite.
So there'd be no point in putting it up again.
It might be an election promise, Barry, but I think when we think about budget repair and can the country afford $170 million on a wasteful, divisive plebiscite, I think that is what electors are thinking about, not the commitment to an election promise.
Right, so there's no point in putting that back again to the Senate.
I wouldn't be arguing that, but I'm sure others may.
Now, on the postal vote, what's wrong with that idea?
Well, the postal vote is worse than the plebiscite. The postal vote has a number of limitations to it. The first, of course, is we don't know how much it costs, and I've seen some media reporting suggest it costs $100 million. I think my colleagues might have been expecting it to be considerably less than that. In addition to that, we don't know what it does to disenfranchise younger voters. Australians travelling abroad, how will they get to participate in a postal ballot? We can't be sure that Australia Post is delivering to every address in our country at the moment. In addition to that, and I think this is probably the most significant issue, it could be agreed by the party, by the government, to conduct a postal plebiscite, but then have it knocked down in the High Court because the legal issues are real. The legal issues are significant.
Now, you know, whatever happens, so much of this is going to be seen through the prism of leadership. How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't think it needs to be. The first thing I'd say is that the Liberal Party, indeed the coalition, is bigger than same-sex marriage. This will not be the only difficult issue that comes across the party room's desk over the next 6 to 12 months. Every difficult issue does not need to be seen through the prism of leadership. This is a test for each and every member of the Parliamentary Liberal Party. First and foremost. It's a respectful place, the party room. People come with their points of view. They do show courtesy to each other. There is an expectation that people come and put their best foot forward and make the most convincing argument that they can. This does not have to be seen through the prism of leadership. I actually think that is a distraction.
Well, maybe it doesn't, but you get the impression the Prime Minister is more intent on managing his party than resolving the issue.
Well, this is an interesting point because I would argue that John Howard had a very, very effective political management tool in his 11 years as Prime Minister, and that was the conscience vote mechanism which he used on 5 separate occasions to deal with difficult issues. RU486, stem cell research, euthanasia. So I would actually argue that while the conscience vote is an important philosophical foundation to our party, I think it's a tried and tested political management tool, and John Howard, none other than John Howard, the sort of person that we sort of hold in this sort of great sort of, in such high esteem. I think that Malcolm Turnbull and indeed my colleagues could channel John Howard's political management techniques on this particular instance.
Now, you're a self-subscribed traditionalist.
I think others would call me a traditionalist as well.
And few of us have missed the photograph of the Queen in your office. The last time, or 5 years ago, you actually spoke in the Senate against gay marriage. You talk about marriage is an institution with a long accepted definition. It has cultural meaning and values. What happened?
This is a very interesting point, Barry. I suspect that my journey on this issue is the same as many, many other Australians. I came to the Parliament 5 years ago and I was very, very clear that I did not support same-sex marriage. I thought of it as a campaign of the far left. I argued that there were more important issues to be debating. I argued that gays and lesbians didn't even necessarily think that this was an important issue. Over those last 5 years, I challenged my own views. I looked more closely at the arguments from those that were arguing against reform, and I came to the conclusion, there were a number of important events through that journey, but I came to the conclusion that there is nothing to fear about same-sex marriage in our country, that the country is overwhelmingly ready for Parliament to legislate for same-sex marriage, and importantly, with a bill like the one that I have constructed, we can have same-sex marriage and religious freedoms and be the better for it.
And you talked about events. Was there a particular event?
I was particularly moved. I was particularly moved by the story of Tory Johnson in the Lint Cafe. I didn't know Tory Johnson. I didn't know his story. I was reading the West Australian newspaper on a regular flight to Albany in the state's far southwest, and I was particularly moved by that particular circumstance. And I don't know Tory's circumstance, but I came to the conclusion that had Tory and his partner been wanting to get married, or had been waiting to get married in the same way that so many gay and lesbian Australians are waiting to get married, and then his life was taken in such a tragic way, that moved me, and it just reinforced my resolve, and I came to the conclusion very quickly, with great clarity, that it is now time to legislate by parliamentary vote same-sex marriage in Australia.
Senator, thanks for joining us this morning. It'll be a fascinating week.
Thank you, Barrie.